Under the dim morning haze that veiled downtown Charleston, South Carolina, the grand steps of the courthouse bore witness to a woman who, by her very presence, was rewriting history. Her name was Justice Camille Rodas, and as she walked up those steps clad in the black robe that had once seemed so distant a dream, it wasn't just fabric draped across her shoulders, it was a shield, a declaration, a silent, thunderous reminder of every battle she had fought to be seen, to be heard, to belong. Camille didn't come from power. She came from a neighborhood where justice didn't knock, where sirens were lullabies and opportunities were whispered myths. Her mother had worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, often coming home too exhausted to cook but never too tired to sit Camille down and say, "They won't make space for you, baby, you're going to have to carve it yourself." And carve it she did, with books as her weapon, silence as her armor, and purpose as her compass. She wasn't the student people bet on in law school. She didn't have legacy connections or prep school polish. But what she did have was a fire, quiet, slow burning, but unrelenting. While others worked, Camille outworked. While others coasted on privilege, she carved truth from stone. Every "you don't belong here," every professor who blinked too long when calling her name, every internship she didn't get despite her grades, she used it all not to rage, to refine, to rise. The day she passed the bar, her mother wept, not for the accomplishment, but for the knowing that her daughter would walk into rooms where she would be the first, the only, and sometimes the least expected. Camille knew too, but she never flinched. So when Governor Ellis appointed her to the Ninth Circuit Court, making her the first black woman to hold that position in the county's history, the announcement was met with more whispers than applause. "She's too young, she's too bold, she's not what this bench is used to." But none of those voices mattered. Camille knew she hadn't been chosen to make others comfortable. She had been chosen to bring balance to a scale long tilted. And yet, for all her accolades and quiet defiance, nothing prepared her for the moment when she stepped into her new courtroom for the first time. It was quiet too. Quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like suspicion. Court officers looked at her, not with respect but with surprise. One clerk even asked, "Are you the new assistant?" That clerk never repeated the question after Camille responded with the gentlest correction, "No, I'm your judge." There was something different about the way people looked at her once she sat behind that bench. Some saw a leader, others saw a threat, but Camille didn't need their acceptance, she needed their compliance. The law didn't care how people felt about her, and neither did she, or so she told herself, until the day the courtroom shifted. It happened on a humid Wednesday morning, the kind where the air feels heavy with something unspoken. The docket was routine, the gallery sparse, but tension somehow hovered like static. Camille felt it before she saw it, the way the bafe stiffened, the way a few heads turned toward the back, and then she walked in. Deputy Sergeant Cara Whitfield, the woman, was a fixture in Charleston law enforcement, decorated, disciplined, and to those who didn't look too closely, deeply respected. But Camille had heard things, not rumors but whispers, about how Cara handled suspects of color with less patience, how she resisted DI training like it was poison, how she once referred to a black public defender as affirmative action in heels. None of it had ever been proven, none of it had ever stuck, but Camille had learned long ago, just because racism doesn't leave a paper trail doesn't mean it doesn't leave damage. And now here she was standing in Camille's courtroom. From the moment their eyes met, Camille knew this wasn't going to be a routine appearance. Carrara's posture was straight, but her eyes burned with a condescension Camille had seen before in professors, in interview panels, and boardrooms where her voice was always 2 octaves too loud for their comfort. Cara didn't just look at Camille. She assessed her, and then without a word crossed her arms and refused to take her place before the bench. The courtroom shifted again, this time in discomfort. Everyone noticed, no one moved. Camille took a breath, let it settle in her chest. This was the moment, not a gavel bang, not a ruling, but this a silent standoff soaked in centuries of power being questioned. "Deputy Whitfield," Camille said, her voice like velvet over steel, "please approach." Cara tilted her head not forward but back, her smile thin and unkind. "I'm not taking orders from her," she said to no one and everyone at once. The words weren't a whisper, they were a detonation, and in their echo the room trembled. Camille felt her hands curl under the bench, felt the heat rise behind her ears, not from shame, from Recognition. She had been warned about moments like this when power tested power, when legitimacy was challenged not by law but by old hateful memory. Carrara's words weren't just disrespect, they were a message: this robe doesn't belong to you. But Camille had heard worse, been through worse, survived worse. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't argue, she simply leaned forward, every inch of her presence a declaration. In this courtroom the law is what speaks, not bias, not history, not fear, the law. And you will follow it. Somewhere in the back a young black intern exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for days. Camille's heart pounded, but her voice didn't shake, because what Kara Whitfield didn't understand, what so many like her refused to see, was that Camille Rodas wasn't alone on that bench. She carried her mother, her ancestors. Every woman told she was too much, every girl told she'd never be enough. She carried truth, and truth, when spoken with grace, is louder than hate could ever be. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore, it was a battlefield, a mirror, a reckoning. And Camille had just begun the moment Kara Whitfield crossed her arms and uttered those 5 words. "I'm not taking orders from her." Something deeper than disrespect rippled through the courtroom. It was more than insolence, more than pride. It was a declaration soaked in entitlement, a sneer shaped by years of believing that authority only came in one form, white male, and molded in her own image. Judge Camille Rodas heard the words not just with her ears but with every cell in her body, because she'd known even before stepping onto that bench that someone like Kara was waiting for her, waiting to challenge the very idea of a black woman holding that much power in a room where obedience was expected. Camille had faced resistance before, covert, slippery, and quiet, but this was overt, public. This wasn't just a disrespectful glance or a passive-aggressive tone, this was open contempt, wrapped in a uniform meant to serve justice, and that made it all the more dangerous. The courtroom had fallen into an eerie silence. Even the court reporter, fingers poised above the keys, seemed unsure whether to document the exchange or hold her breath. Kara hadn't moved an inch. Her arms stayed folded like a wall. Her badge gleamed under the overhead lights, not as a symbol of honor but as a warning. Camille could see the ripple effect in the room, how one act of insubordination gave silent permission for others to question, to doubt, to reconsider the authority of the woman seated behind the bench. Camille didn't blink. She had learned long ago that the most powerful response to rage was resolve. She addressed Kara again, her voice calm but edged with finality. "Deputy Whitfield, you are ordered to approach this bench and comply with the court's procedures, or you will be held in contempt." Kara scoffed, her mouth curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. "You think that robe makes you something? You don't get to tell me what to do." The words weren't just meant to provoke, they were meant to dehumanize, to shrink Camille down into someone undeserving of the title she'd earned. This time murmurs stirred in the gallery. A few officers exchanged glances. One defense attorney visibly winced. The mask had slipped off Kara, and everyone was seeing her for what she truly was. Still no one moved, no one spoke. It was in this suspended moment that Camille saw the entire structure behind Kara's words, the silent scaffold of complicity. Because Kara wasn't alone, her defiance had been allowed to fester in a system that never forced her to confront it. She had always been protected by silence, by loyalty, by those too afraid to disrupt their own comfort. Camille rose slowly, letting the weight of her robe fall behind her like a curtain lifting on truth. This court does not operate on personal feelings, prejudices, or the comfort levels of its officers, she said. It operates on the rule of law, and if you cannot adhere to that standard, you are not fit to wear that badge. Her words hit like thunder in a place built to be still. Kara's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Camille turned to the bailiff, whose posture straightened like he had been waiting his whole life to be told it was okay to act. "Deputy Whitfield is now in contempt of court. Please escort her out." Even then Kara hesitated, not because she was surprised but because she was clinging to the myth that her authority, her years on the force would protect her, that she was untouchable. But the bailiff moved forward and the illusion shattered as she was led away. Kara hurled one last line over her shoulder, "This isn't over." Camille didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was stronger than any rebuttal, and in that silence the room began to shift, not loudly, not immediately, but irrevocably. That day Camille didn't just maintain order, she redefined it. In the hours that followed, the courtroom buzzed With subtle energy, officers who once barely looked her in the eye now addressed her with deliberate clarity. Attorneys stood a little straighter, even the court reporter who had captured every word, every pause, every breath offered Camille a nod of quiet respect as she exited the bench, but Camille knew the moment wasn't over. Not really. She sat alone in her chambers after court recess, staring at the wall of degrees and awards that had once meant everything. Now they felt like armor, not against the law but against the minds that couldn't accept that someone like her could wear them. She thought about her journey, not the headlines or ceremonies, but the weight of proving herself over and over again, of having to be impeccable so that no one could claim she wasn't worthy. She had worked twice as hard, been twice as careful, and still it hadn't been enough for someone like Kara Whitfield. But maybe that was the point. Kara wasn't built to accept someone like Camille behind the bench. She was built to resist her, and now that Camille had shown she would not bend, Carol was going to become something else. A symbol, a case study in what happens when power goes unchecked for too long. Camille knew there would be consequences, not for her but for the institution, because if a deputy could disrespect a judge in open court and not be immediately disciplined, what message did that send to the public? What message did it send to the next young black attorney watching from the gallery, hoping her future wouldn't be stained by the same shadows? This was no longer just about a courtroom incident. This was about systems, about accountability, about whether justice could truly serve everyone or only those who looked a certain way. Camille picked up her phone. "Get me the chief of police," she said. The time for silence had passed. Now came the reckoning. The incident in Judge Camille Rodas's courtroom might have ended with Deputy Kara Whitfield being escorted out in contempt, but the echoes of her defiance rang far beyond the walls of the judicial chamber. For Camille, it wasn't simply about what had happened in plain sight, it was about what had been allowed to grow in silence, what was hiding in the shadowed corners of an institution she had once hoped to trust. Days passed, but Camille couldn't shake the heaviness the outrage on social media had sparked. Debate supporters hailed her composure and courage, while others questioned whether Kara had really meant it that way. But Camille knew better. She'd spent her entire life decoding that kind of language, that tone. People like you. It was never accidental. It was a legacy spoken through clenched jaws and tight smiles, and Camille understood something else too. Kara's outburst was not a singular act of rebellion, it was a symptom, and symptoms pointed to something deeper, something festering. It wasn't long before that truth came calling. Chief Harold Mendes requested a closed-door meeting with Camille at City Hall. A man known for walking the thin line between tradition and reform, Mendes looked older than usual when she entered the room, lines carved deep into his forehead, his hands folded too tightly in his lap. "She's not acting alone," he said after a long silence between them. "We've been watching Carrera for a while. Reports, complaints, subtle indicators that something was off, but your courtroom confrontation blew the lid off. We opened a deeper investigation, and what we're finding, it's worse than we thought." Camille sat still, her breath slow but sharp. Her instincts had been right. Mendes leaned forward, sliding a file across the polished table toward her. She opened it, and was met with photographs, surveillance reports, and redacted emails. Kara Whitfield had been attending secret meetings with a group known for extremist ideologies, an underground movement within the state's law enforcement apparatus that masked itself under the guise of preserving tradition but operated with clear racial animus. They referred to themselves as the Reclaimers. "There's a network," Mendes continued, his voice grave, "not just in this precinct, not just officers, it stretches across counties. They've been quietly recruiting, manipulating data, even intimidating internal whistleblowers." Camille stared at the images of Carrera standing shoulder to shoulder with known affiliates of hate groups, her uniform still visible in some shots. The same uniform she had worn into Camille's courtroom, armed not with justice but with a quiet war against everything. Camille represented the realization twisted something deep inside Camille, not fear but betrayal. She had spent her career believing the system could be better, that justice could rise from within if good people stayed and fought for it. But what do you do when the rot isn't just around you but rooted within the very core? The storm didn't stop there. Whistleblowers came forward, officers of color, junior deputies, administrative staff. Quiet voices that had been silenced for years now felt safe enough To speak, they told stories of Carrara's coded comments, her manipulative tactics, her leadership of internal group chats where jokes about race, gender, and taking back the badge were common, some shared screenshots, audio clips, all pointing to a coordinated effort to undermine not only Camille but anyone who didn't fit the mold Kara deemed acceptable, and Camille, despite her strength, felt the cracks beneath her, not because she was breaking but because the weight of truth was becoming so heavy, so undeniable it had to be carried together. This was no longer about her courtroom, it was about the institution, about the many Karas hiding behind polite nods and polished badges. The media caught wind of the scandal. Racist cop exposed in courtroom clash read the headlines, but Camille knew that truth couldn't be confined to clickbait. The real story was more complicated, more insidious, and more urgent. She didn't want vengeance, she wanted reform. So she worked alongside Chief Mendes and a special independent ethics committee to investigate every corner of the system. Officers were interviewed under oath, internal audits unearthed decades of bias buried beneath red tape, and Camille didn't just sit in meetings, she asked questions, demanded transparency, used her platform to amplify voices long ignored. But the deeper she went, the more she uncovered: promotions denied, complaints lost, discipline reports that vanished after being re-evaluated. There was a pattern of protection that had allowed Carrara and others like her to rise unchecked, and in the heart of all this, Camille's own life began to shift. She received veiled threats, anonymous letters slipped under her chamber door, a slashed tire one morning. After court, her daughter Maya asked if the people outside were mad at Mommy. Camille hugged her tighter than she ever had. Still, she didn't retreat, because this was no longer about fear, it was about responsibility. She owed it to the community, to the bench, to every young black woman studying law and wondering if she'd ever truly belong. Camille had stared into the eyes of systemic rot, and rather than look away, she leaned in. A week before the official press conference, Camille stood alone in her chambers and opened the file again. Kara's smirk stared back from a surveillance photo, bold and unrepentant, but beside her, Camille now saw the faces of the officers who had spoken up, the court clerks who whispered, "Thank you," the community members who flooded her inbox with gratitude. The balance was shifting. The storm behind the badge had been revealed, not by force, not by spectacle, but by a woman in a robe who refused to bow to hate, who instead turned silence into strategy and confrontation into a catalyst. Camille Rodas wasn't just responding to a courtroom outburst, she was rewriting the rules of accountability in a city that could no longer afford to pretend justice was blind, and the reckoning, it had only just begun. In the days that followed the full exposure of the Reclaimers Network, the city of Charleston found itself standing at a crossroad, one between truth and denial, between reform and rot, and at the center of it all stood Judge Camille Rodas, the woman whose presence on the bench had shaken the status quo and now threatened to dismantle a carefully preserved illusion of justice the public once divided in. Hushed whispers about what really happened in that courtroom was now fully engaged. The city could no longer look away, because this wasn't just about Deputy Kara Whitfield, this was about an entire system being put on trial. Camille had always believed in the law, not blindly, not naively, but with a measured hope that justice, even when flawed, could be repaired through courage, transparency, and commitment. Yet now, seated behind her chamber desk, reviewing the list of names implicated in the investigation, officers, clerks, supervisors, she realized something sobering: the justice system wasn't broken, it had been operating exactly as it was built to. What was broken was the belief that fairness alone had ever been its foundation. That reckoning came to a head when the city announced the formation of a public tribunal, a rare but necessary legal proceeding that would examine systemic misconduct both from a criminal and civic standpoint. Camille was asked to testify not just about the day Kara refused her orders, but about everything that followed: the threats, the cover-ups, the truths uncovered in dark files and confidential whispers. It wasn't a comfortable role for Camille. Judges don't often take the stand, they don't step into the center of the courtroom spotlight, but this wasn't about protocol anymore. It was about restoring faith where silence had allowed rot to grow. The hearing took place inside Charleston's historic Jefferson Hall, a building that had witnessed centuries of American law but never like This rows of reporters filled the gallery, cameras lined the back wall. The city's heartbeat pulsed through the wood-paneled room like a drum of urgency. Camille sat in the witness chair, not robed this time, but composed, her voice steady, her presence unyielding. She told them everything. She spoke of Carrara's open defiance of the coded "insult the people like you" that rang louder than any gavel strike. She detailed the aftermath, the emails with threats to her home, the anonymous surveillance, the fear that crept into her daughter's eyes. But most importantly, Camille painted a portrait of a system that had been weaponized against truth, where rank was protection, where silence was rewarded, where diversity was celebrated in marketing but punished in practice. Across the aisle, Cara Whitfield sat stone-faced beside her attorney. Her badge had long been revoked, but her disdain had not. She didn't look at Camille once, not during her testimony, not during the presentation of evidence that showed she had helped fund reclaimer operations, not during the recordings of her mocking black citizens with colleagues over private comms. She remained still, her silence now a mask for a fall from grace she refused to accept. But Camille didn't speak to Carrara, she spoke to the city. There are people, she said, voice full of quiet force, who wear the uniform not to serve but to intimidate, who enter these halls not to uphold justice but to protect their own power, and if we allow that to go unchecked, if we confuse order with fairness, we have failed the very people the law is meant to protect. The room didn't erupt, it didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Witness after witness supported Camille's testimony, officers who'd been afraid to speak, citizens who had filed complaints that vanished, even a former sergeant who revealed how he had once been forced to falsify a report to protect Carrara. The pattern was undeniable. Carrara's insubordination had merely been the match the system had long been drenched in gasoline, and yet as clear as the evidence was, Camille knew justice would still be hard won. There were whispers of backlash, murmurs of witch hunt from corners of the city. Unwilling to confront their comfort, some called the hearings politically motivated, others a distraction from real crime. But Camille had learned that resistance to truth was often the final refuge of a threatened system, and so she didn't back down. She proposed concrete reforms, a civilian oversight board with real enforcement power, mandatory amphibious training for all court officers, whistleblower protections with legal safeguards. She advocated for transparency, not just in policy but in culture, a shift in how authority was taught, how power was perceived, and how justice was delivered. At the end of the week-long tribunal, Cara Whitfield was convicted of conspiracy to obstruct justice, abuse of authority, and misconduct in public office. She was sentenced not just to prison time but to the loss of everything she once wielded as a weapon, her badge, her pension, her platform. But even that, Camille knew, was not the final chapter, because the true victory was not Carrara's conviction, it was the city's awakening. Charleston had seen something it couldn't unsee, that racism in uniform wasn't just about individual hatred but institutional permission, and that when a black woman in a robe speaks truth into that system, she doesn't just deliver justice, she redeems it. Camille left the tribunal not as a symbol but as a steward of change. She walked out into the sunlight with no headlines, no applause, just the quiet knowledge that justice, when demanded by those once denied it, becomes a fire no institution can contain. Justice wasn't on trial, power wasn't. For the first time in a long time, power had been forced to listen. The echo of the tribunal had barely faded when Judge Camille Rodas stepped once more into her courtroom, not as a symbol on trial, not as a woman fighting for her seat, but as a judge reclaiming her rightful space. The room was the same, wood pane walls, rows of pews, the soft creak of the bailiff's shoes, but something fundamental had shifted. The silence no longer felt like resistance, it felt like reverence. People looked at her not with doubt but with quiet acknowledgement. The gavel that had once been questioned now stood as a reminder: truth, when spoken with courage, does not return void. Camille didn't wear defiance, she wore purpose. She moved through her day with the kind of clarity that only comes from surviving a storm and still standing upright. Every ruling, every objection sustained or overruled carried a weight she didn't take lightly, but this time she no longer bore it alone. She knew the city had seen the shadows she named, and more importantly, they had chosen to believe her. There was no grand speech that morning, No dramatic announcement, Camille simply called the court to order and began. Justice wasn't a performance, it was a practice, and her bench, once a place she had to defend, was now a platform she could finally expand. From later that afternoon, as the courtroom emptied and the light from the window carved golden streaks across the polished floor, a young law clerk lingered by the door. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her posture uncertain, her eyes wide with the weight of something unspoken. "I watched everything," she said quietly. "The tribunal, the testimony. I just wanted you to know you changed how I see this place, how I see what's possible." Camille smiled, not out of pride, but understanding. She had once been that girl searching for proof that someone who looked like her could rise without shrinking, lead without apology. "You don't have to wait for permission," Camille said. "You just have to know your voice is already enough." When the clerk left, Camille turned back to the bench. She reached out her hand, resting for a moment on the smooth wood. So much had been fought for here, so much had been taken, but today it remained hers, not by chance, not by charity, but by choice, by truth, by the resolve to make justice not a closed door but a place where everyone is seen. The gavel didn't just stand, it stood for something, and Camille Rodas wasn't just holding it anymore, she was wielding it for every unheard voice, every silenced name, and every generation still waiting to be seen. The story of Judge Camille Rodas is not just about one woman's fight to be respected in a courtroom, it's a mirror reflecting a deeper truth about power, identity, and perseverance in the face of deeply ingrained injustice. Camille's journey from quiet authority to a defiant force for equity isn't defined by a single confrontation, but by every moment she chose to stand when it would have been easier to step back. She didn't just survive the attack on her integrity, she transformed it into a rallying cry for every individual who's ever been told they didn't belong in a room they earned their way into. When Officer Rachel Donnelly, wearing the shield of law enforcement, refused to acknowledge Camille's authority, it was more than insubordination, it was a declaration that power should only look one way, sound one way, and follow one narrow path. But Camille's presence shattered that illusion. Her poise, even under direct assault, first in court then in her private life, wasn't just admirable, it was revolutionary. She reminded the world that justice is not about appearances or titles, it's about the courage to uphold truth, even when truth is uncomfortable, especially when it is. Camille endured threats, sabotage, and public humiliation, but she never let those challenges define her. She chose clarity over chaos, calm over retaliation, and conviction over compromise, and in doing so she didn't just reclaim her courtroom, she redefined it. She didn't silence her critics through rage, she dismantled their platform with grace, precision, and undeniable legitimacy. She stood not just as a judge but as a woman who understood that the most powerful resistance doesn't come through anger, it comes through action. The lesson from Camille's story is clear: real justice requires more than laws, it requires people brave enough to enforce them without bias, without fear, and without favor for those watching from the sidelines of their own lives, feeling unheard, unseen, underestimated. Camille's resilience is a blueprint. You don't have to meet hate with hate, you can meet it with truth. You can meet it with strength grounded in purpose, whether you're leading a team, raising a child, or standing up for yourself in a difficult workplace.